Some
That's
squeaky
a little
noise.
noisy.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it was Brice Rhodes who decided that Christopher Jones was going to die that night. It was Brice Rhodes who shot him. It was Brice Rhodes who decided that Larry and Maurice had to go. It was Brice Rhodes who stabbed them over and over and over. It was Brice Rhodes who gave the knife to Anwan Carter, to Ja'Cory Taylor, to Tieran Coleman, to the unknown man, to make sure they were all in it. He learned his lesson last time about people talking. It was Brice Rhodes who took those bodies to River Park and burned them. There are so many profoundly tragic parts of this case. I don't know which is the worst. There's Christopher Jones, father of 3, crossing the street in the West End, nothing to do with any of this. Shot dead for the stupidest of reasons. Larry and Maurice, killed because they did what we would want any teen to do in this circumstance. Go to your mom. These 4 children, so desperate for adult male guidance that they keep hanging out with Brice Rhodes even after they became scared of him because of Christopher Jones's murder. There's Ja'Cory, who had nowhere else to go, sleeping in stairwells, going over there even when he didn't want to, because that was a place where he could spend the night. Maurice tied up with a sock in his mouth, bound, knowing his little brother's in the bathroom. There's Larry stuck in the bathroom, not knowing what's going on outside, we hope. And then Larry struggling when he comes out and sees the blood on the floor. Anwan Carter and Ja'Cory Taylor feeling they have no other option but to follow the orders of that man who forced them to participate in the murder of their best friends. Forced them to clean up after, forced them into this life that they now have. Arrest, prosecution, juvenile custody, adult custody, felony convictions, prison, having to come to court and testify. That is what this man has done to this entire group of children. Now, how do you know, based on the evidence presented here, that Brice Rhodes is guilty? A lot of it does have to do with the statements of Anwan Carter and Ja'Cory Taylor, but their statements were corroborated by other evidence in this case. So let's go over what we have. First of all, this case is charged in complicity, and you'll have this definition with you. It's on your jury instructions. But it means that you don't have to worry about who stabbed the fatal stab. If you believe that Brice Rhodes orchestrated this, if you believe that he was in on it, if you believe that he was commanding or soliciting or engaging in conspiracy with them, you don't have to worry about what stab wound killed them. He is guilty of the whole act. To return to how do we know he is guilty, we will start with the murder of Christopher Jones. Now, Anwan Carter told you he was following behind the blue Mazda. He knew that Rhodes was in the driver's seat, or the driver's side rear seat. He saw Rhodes shoot out the window and kill Mr. Jones. He admitted, Mr. Carter did, that he drove over Mr. Jones. And Dr. Lippincott told you that there was a wound on the head, a bruising that could be consistent. We don't know if that head bruising was caused by running over. But whether it was intentional or not, we know that Mr. Jones would not have been in that road lying prone to get run over by the pickup truck if Brice Rhodes hadn't just shot him. So again, complicity, He's in it. Now, Ja'Cory Taylor told you he was right next to Rhodes, inside the Mazda, when Rhodes shot and killed Christopher Jones.
Stop the car. You see somebody in the middle of the street. And Brice told me I could see him. Shot him.
Who shot him?
Brice.
Brice Rhodes shot him. Ja'Cory Taylor told you he saw Brice Rhodes shoot him. Now, both of them described the Mazda in front, the pickup truck behind, and you saw on the Ring video that Detective Griffin found on the block that night, from that night, that there is a small car driving past, immediately followed by a pickup truck. And that tells you that they're not making this up. Ja'Cory and Anwan aren't making this up. Again, the shots that night, the one shot followed by 5, you heard that came in on the 911 call. Somebody said one shot followed by 5. Anwan Carter told you that after Brice Rhodes shot Christopher Jones, they drove down the block a little way and he fired off about 5 shots at a house. One shot followed by 5. Now, the defense pressured Detective Griffin on, why didn't you change the report when you only found one casing on the street? This is an example of why you don't change a report. Because it is a fact that the 911 call came in that way. Then later they talked to Anwan Carter. They find out why there are 5 shots following. And this goes to show that they're not making this story up. Anwan Carter was there that night. He wouldn't have known about the one shot followed by 5 that came in on the 911 call unless he was there. Now, this, he was in front. Ja'Cory was in front in the Mazda. I don't know if he turned around, saw what was happening. It makes total sense that he wouldn't have seen. He just saw Brice Rhodes kill a man. Makes total sense that he didn't turn around and see what Anwan Carter did with that car. So we know that they were there. I guess the defense wants you to believe that these kids just, took a Mazda and a pickup truck over there to commit this murder for no reason? That's what doesn't make sense. 15 years old, Larry was 14. So Larry 14, Anwan 15. Then you have Maurice 16, Ja'Cory 17. But these 4 teenagers drove over there. They were there because Brice Rhodes brought them there. And the rest of the story doesn't make sense except how they told it. Larry and Maurice started telling their mother Brice Rhodes was mad about it and he killed them for it. This crime had an effect on these kids, as Ja'Cory told you.
He ain't never seen nobody get shot. I'm not gonna lie, because I was it wasn't just him too, he was also all of us.
You were scared?
So, don't say we didn't go. Just be along with him.
The words and emotions of Ja'Cory Taylor, now age 25, having been to prison, having lived 7.5 years since that day. It affected him. It affected Maurice and Larry. And the defense pointed out that when Ja'Cory Taylor first came in here, he wouldn't testify. He started to, then he stopped. It took a while. As they said, he was threatened, but that was with contempt of court, the same thing any witness has to abide by. You come in here, you have to testify when you're under subpoena. He was here for what is possibly the scariest thing that happens to anyone, to come into a courtroom, to talk about what happened, tell about something that's horrific, public speaking, and he had to do it in front of the defendant and in front of the families of the victims. So it is no wonder that he was scared, that he was emotional, that it took him a while to get there. So they were scared. Larry and Maurice told their mom. What did he tell you wanted to do to them?
So we got to kill him.
Brice Rhodes said, we got to kill him. And we'll talk about the instructions later on, but this is how you know it's an intentional murder. He told them they were going to go kill somebody with a price on his head. It ended up being Christopher Jones. And look, we have no reason to think that Christopher Jones had a price on his head, and I'm not saying that the person who did have a price on his head, if that person exists, deserved to die either. No one deserved to die that night. But he told that there was a person with a price on their head, and that's why they were going down there, to collect this money. And you heard from Anwar and Jaburi that the money was never distributed. So we don't have any proof whatsoever that Mr. Jones was anything but crossing the street. But that was Brice Rhodes' intent, to kill Christopher Jones, and this is his intent, to kill Larry and Maurice because they were telling. All right, now we come to Saturday, May 21st. Christopher Jensen told you that Rhodes borrowed his car that day, the Dodge Charger. Rhodes admitted in a statement that he probably was in front of Larry and Maurice's house in that car. Later, you have Ja'Cory Taylor and Amon Carter riding around with Q. They stop by Maurice and Larry's. Boys aren't home. They eventually head over to Rhodes's. Q drops them off. Imagine how relieved Q is that he decided not to go in there that night. So Anwan and Ja'Cory arrive. Everything's fine at first. People present are Rhodes, Larry, Maurice, Tieran Coleman, unknown male, unknown female. I have a few things to say about that while we're here. The unknown female and the unknown male have never been identified because Detective Tonelli has nothing to go on but their complexion and their gender. These were a 15-year-old and 17-year-old witnesses at the time. They went into a house. They weren't introduced enough that they retained names from this situation, if they were introduced at all. Hung out with these people. Female left. The other guy stayed, but they couldn't describe him any more than light-skinned male. So Detective Tonelli can certainly not go rounding up every white female and every light-skinned male in this county, nor do we want him to. He could not continue that investigation without more to go on. But Anwan Carter was able to give him more about Tieran Coleman. At the time, he was describing him as a dark-skinned male and was able to point out a rap video, local rap video, that fellow had appeared in. So based on that, Detective Tonelli was able to build a photo pack, show Anwan Carter, he identified it, and then the investigation into Tieran Coleman took off. So with enough information, of course, he continued the investigation. He would have liked to have done it with the other individual, but he did not have that extra clue as to what direction to take the investigation in. Now, Tieran Coleman is obviously not here. You know that his case is being handled separately. If you believe the rest of this beyond a reasonable doubt, then that's one of those things I talked about in voir dire. Sometimes you do have questions. You're sitting there in the jury room, you might be like, well, I really would like to know why Tieran Coleman wasn't there. If it's not A or B or C on the jury instructions, if it does not affect your reasonable doubt of those questions, set it aside. It's a question that you can ask afterwards, but do not let it affect you now. if you believe everything else beyond a reasonable doubt. All right, to return to the events of that evening, we heard from both Anwan Carter and Jacory Taylor. Jacory and Maurice got into it. Maurice grabbed a knife. Jacory jumped back. Brice Rhodes took the knife from Maurice and hit Maurice. He then powwowed with everyone else, what Anwan Carter described as a vote and Jacory described as a conversation. Anwan remembers being the only one. Jacory remembers that he and Anwan did not want to do it. I don't know how he was phrasing things. I don't know what Anwan picked up from him. They are both telling about their memories here. And I skipped over this one. Purchase in a trailer park. I don't remember that, but if you do, go with your memory. But obviously, as far as the events of that night with how this gun was purchased, as Jacory Taylor was the one who purchased the gun, he would have a great memory of it. Anyway, votes for conversation, discussion. But what is important from that is that Brice Rhodes was still planning to kill them. He still had the intention that they die that night, but he wanted to make sure that everybody was involved. So he tied up Maurice, had Jacory punch him in the stomach as a violation, discipline, I guess. And then he began to stab Maurice over and over.
How many times did Brice Rhodes stab him? Where did he stab him? Was he standing up or was he on his knees?
He was on his knees.
And he stabbed him in the chest?
Chest, stomach. His chest, stomach, on his torso.
He stabbed him in other places? How long did this go on for?
He stopped breathing.
Until he stopped breathing. You saw the autopsy photos. You know that he was stabbed over and over. Larry was in the bathroom. Rhodes dumped Maurice by the door and had them bring Larry out. And he stabbed Larry over and over. And again, you've seen the autopsy photos. We'll have them back there. I don't want to show the courtroom, but we heard the testimony.
Did he know what had happened to his brother? Was there blood in the spot that he was at? Did he respond to that?
Yeah, he tried to kick everything off, get his hands intact, his hands free still.
Was his brother making any noise at that point?
Yeah.
So how many times did he get stabbed?
I don't know. But
Was stabbing?
he stabbed until he was dead.
Brice did.
He passed the knife on him.
Who did he pass the knife to? Why did he pass you the knife? They're both dead, right?
Yeah, he said, so we all would be in it. So now it's good.
He said we're all going to be in it. He wanted it to be on all of them now. He had learned his lesson on people talking. Jacory's description was similar.
I just remember you saying we had time up. Tied him up. Stabbed not recently.
Who stabbed Maurice?
Brice.
Was Maurice tied up at that point?
Yeah, he was tied up.
What was used to tie him up?
I don't remember his name. He was tied up.
Okay, who did the tying?
Brice did. Somebody else that was there. I don't remember. Somebody saw he was tied up. He was trying to
What was Maurice doing while this was going on? Who was in the room while this was happening?
Yeah. It was me, brother. Brice, and two other people. We was pretty much fighting, you know, like trying to, he made that one stab. Once that one stab, we kind of moved to the door. We had me standing there.
You were standing by the door?
Two other people that was in there, I didn't really know. They was already there when we got there, so I'm thinking that, you know what I'm saying? My man, I couldn't do nothing, stand there. Wondering if somebody's gonna do something to us, but I'm not trying to interrupt anything, so he kind of took my wrist to the door. They all, I don't really know who, but that's when he goes to the door. Larry was in the bed. We made Larry come out. And the same day after Larry, once he did Larry, he made me stab Larry.
Dr. Lippincott told you that the cause of death was multiple stab wounds. She said Larry had 21 stab wounds. You can see in Maurice's autopsy photos that he has 8 to his abdomen alone, other wounds to his back, other areas of his body. Dr. Lippincott told you the areas: abdomen, torso, pelvis, back, groin, genitals. Rhodes made Anwan and Ja'Cory clean the house while he took the bodies over to River Park and set them on fire. He later drove the boys around to various dumpsters burning evidence. The knife was never found. We introduced photos of the knives that were collected to show you that police collected what they could find. We don't know, maybe those are the murder weapon. I don't think so. They don't match the description. They drove around different dumpsters that night, setting different dumpsters on fire. I would assume that's where the murder weapon is. As Detective Peters told you, there were approximately 7 reports of dumpster fires that day. And by the time 2 days later that he was checking, most of them had already been emptied. It's actually amazing that the pink blanket with Maurice's DNA on it was located. Anyway, that night, they noticed the back seat was bloody, so Rose tore it out and dumped it behind someone's garage, as Anwan Carter told you. Before I turn the page here, whether Taylor stole the boots, he said that he and Maurice both had those boots, that they started out as his, he lent them to Maurice. He didn't remember how the boots got there that night. He took the boots at the end of the night, though, and they had blood on them. This was just all part of the investigation. Now, yes, their stories are inconsistent on these points. I think there's an explanation for each one, but I also think this shows you that these stories were not concocted. They didn't sit there and memorize each other's statements. They came in here and told you about something they remember from 7 years ago. And these are all minor points. Sorts of things that would become fuzzy after 7 years. The things they did say, the things they do remember, that Rhodes tied up Maurice, that Rhodes stabbed Maurice, that Rhodes made them participate, that Larry was stuck in the bathroom, that Rhodes tied up Larry. Those are the things they remember because that's what you would remember from all of this. All right, we've heard a lot about the police investigation over the past week, so I'm just going to summarize because I know that you all took in all this information, witness after witness. The response to River Park, the lack of any identifying information on the victims, how the police were trying to figure out who they were. It was not until Olmsted Academy contacted police and they realized that it was Maurice and Larry, that the case moved forward. Detective Tonelli went to Elizabeth Wren's house, spoke to her brother TJ. TJ Wren led Sergeant Vance to Brice Rhodes' address on Haight Avenue. Vance saw Rhodes go into and out of the apartment and then followed him until they could take him into custody. In the defendant's interview, he admitted knowing the boys. You might have noticed, though, that he chatted with the detectives for quite a while. They were phrasing it as a missing persons conversation. Chatted with them for a while before he said, "Oh yeah, TJ told me they were dead." Which would be a little odd if he weren't involved with this. He admitted he was probably in front of their house in the Charger the last day they were seen.
We got video of the Charger being there on Saturday. We went in front of that. Maurice's house.
And yes, Detective Tonelli said that was on video, and it wasn't on video. But that's a police investigative technique. Police don't walk into an interview room and say, "Excuse me, have you participated in 1 to 3 murders lately?" No? Okay, well, thanks for your time. They have to use techniques to get people talking, and that was one that they were attempting. And he did admit to being there, probably. Okay, meanwhile, while this is going on, detectives are over on Haight serving a search warrant. And no, there was no bloody scene when they walked in. Why? Because the boys spent all night cleaning it up at the direction of Brice Rhodes. They collect the knives because they know that this is a stabbing case, possible murder weapon. Meanwhile, you have Sergeant Vance and the marshals pinging Maurice's phone, finding it with Anwan Carter, who was so young and naive that he didn't know that police could track a cell phone. Anwan Carter was interviewed. And he didn't change his story multiple times, he changed it once. In the beginning, he told them that he didn't know what happened. Then his mother and sister arrived. He spoke to them. He asked to speak to the police again. And that is when he changed his story. That is when he told police about his involvement and the involvement of Brice Rhodes in this case. Months later, he repeated it at a proffer at the time of his plea, and in court he repeated it to you. But it's important to note that he was already saying this long before the prosecution of the case and any sort of plea negotiations had started. He admitted his involvement, and he talked about doing anything he did at the direction of Brice Rhodes. He talked about Brice Rhodes wanting to kill Maurice and Larry and killing Maurice and Larry, wanting to kill Christopher Jones and killing Christopher Jones that night that he was picked up, May 24th. Thus the second search warrant, because now police knew where the murder happened. And you saw the pictures of the carpet being pulled up. This is not something police are going to do willy-nilly at everyone's apartment that's involved in a crime. They needed a second search warrant because now they knew that this was a murder scene. And so now they had enough probable cause to go in and rip carpet up. And yes, the video was dark that you heard from Rebecca Kimmer. They tried to get it on video. It was dark. That's why they turned to the next step, which was just taking the carpet itself and testing that for blood. The police also interviewed the person who had rented the car that Rhodes was driving that day, who happened to be his neighbor, who was able to direct police to the blue Mazda with no backseat, reeking of bleach. Both cars were processed. Other people were interviewed, some of them with no further information. There was a child at Olmsted who was interviewed, Brice Rhodes' mother, cousin Q. The next day, Corey Taylor was arrested and interviewed. Detective Peters and Metzler were finishing up the dumpster search, and later Sergeant Vance collected the boots. So what do we know from all of this? From the second search warrant, we know that the carpet was covered in blood, as was the carpet padding. And we know, because Stephen Barrett, the analyst from the lab, The blood matched Larry at an estimated frequency in the nonillions, which is far higher than the billions of people that are on the earth today. So there's a 1 in nonillion chance that that wasn't Larry's DNA. So they took various cuttings from the carpet. On one of them, exhibit 24-1, it was Larry plus one other person. On the other one, it was Larry. From the carpet padding, same thing, Larry and one other person. The DNA for the other person was too limited to make a determination. But this makes sense, as Larry was the second person to bleed out on the carpet. What else do we know about from the apartment? Thought that was interesting. I'm not saying that everybody that bought White Castle that weekend was involved in this, but I do think that's interesting. All right, we know that these sheets were off some of the beds, pillowcases off the beds, and we know that a lot of bedding was found in that dumpster, burnt and bloody. What do we know from the dumpster search? We know that Detective Peters, Detective Metzler were faced with a dumpster full of trash. We know that the reason they were looking in dumpsters at all was because the back seat was missing. They wouldn't have gone out just to search for one pink blanket. But fortunately, that's what they found. But we'll get there in a second. So they come to this dumpster, it's full of trash. They call in and say, found it, thinking that some of this was going to be the back seat material. And that's what Detective Tonelli was left with. This search, you heard, took hours. It took well past midnight. He'd been told they found the back seat, and they did not come back to him at the end of this and say, we found a lot of bloody sheets and blankets and towels, but we didn't find the back seat. He just did not get that information. So when he went to testify, he testified in the probable cause hearing that he believed they had found the back seat. He qualified it. He said, further testing, we're awaiting further testing, but we believe we have the back seat, because that's what he believed at that time. And it was not until he started getting all the reports, and really, he's got other cases going on. I mean, we all wish that we were all straight on the back seat from the very first moment. But yes, he's got other cases going on. We were sitting here. The judge said, what's the biggest thing you've got to bring in? He's speaking from memory about reports that he looks at from time to time, but didn't study up on before every court appearance, and he said probably the back seat. If he could find the back seat, he would have brought it to you. He would have tested it, but that back seat was never found. And we know what happened to the back seat, something that police only found out about later at a subsequent interview when Detective Tonelli did say to Anwan, what happened to the back seat? And Anwan told him and tried to show him on his phone, tried to show him where the garage was, but only knew the neighborhood, didn't know the exact location. All right, so we have the dumpster. We have the pink blanket found in the dumpster. As Stephen Barrett told you, from the pink blanket, in two different spots, Maurice's blood was recovered. Now, while we are on the subject of the labs, what else do we know? The tire tracks from the scene were compared to the Mazda's tires. Scott Doyle told you it's really difficult to get a comparison on tires, and in fact, in this case, he was not able to identify or eliminate the Mazda. The shoe prints, he was able to eliminate those shoes from the shoes that Brice Rhodes was arrested in. But we don't know what shoes he was wearing that night. I wouldn't be shocked if they weren't burned in that dumpster or a different dumpster. From the Mazda, swabs were taken from the driver's seat back near the headrest. They were presumptively positive for blood, and Stephen Barrett was able to find a partial DNA profile, mixture of at least two individuals Due to the limited nature, no meaningful comparison could be made. So blood was found in the Mazda. It was not found on the parts near the where the back seat would have been, either because that area was bleached. 2 different detectives told you the car smelled heavily of bleach, and the analyst told you that bleach can degrade a sample, or because the blood was on the back seat that got ripped off. Anwan told you that that seat was covered in blood, and that's why Brice Rhodes decided it had to go. That's where the blood was in the car. And the reason that it is not here in these lab reports for analysts to tell you about it is because Brice Rhodes got rid of it. Now, Brice Rhodes' DNA was not found anywhere but on the gear shift or the steering wheel. That's true. But you know who else's DNA is not anywhere on these lab reports? Anwan Carter and Ja'Cory Taylor. The reason that Rhodes' DNA, Ja'Cory's DNA, Anwan's DNA is not all over the place is because they are not the ones who are bleeding out on all these pieces of evidence. It is Larry and Maurice who are bleeding on the evidence, and it is their DNA who is found. If they want to say that because Rhodes' DNA is not on anything, he wasn't involved in this, the same would hold true for Ja'Cory Taylor and Anwan Carter. Their DNA is not on it either. We know they were involved in it because they told you. So the same logic does not exonerate him from that analysis. The DNA in Rhodes' apartment, the DNA on the blanket in the dumpster, the ripped out back seat, these all corroborate what Anwan Carter and Ja'Cory Taylor told you. Obviously, the defense does not want you to trust them. They asked in opening, why are Taylor and Carter still alive? Well, 1, they weren't the people who told their mother. 2, he had learned his lesson and made them get involved in the second one. And 3, police put an end to this before anything could happen in future. We don't know what would have happened 2 weeks later. Carter told the truth 2 days after the murder, after initially not, but then talking to his mother and sister. Do you think that his mother and sister came in there and said, I've got an idea, why don't you tell them that you're involved? Why don't you tell them that you stabbed them too? That's a great idea. No, they went in there and said, tell the truth. If this were not the truth, he would have said, I was just an eyewitness. I just saw it happen. I didn't do anything. The fact that Carter gave them so much information that led to his own conviction for facilitation to murder corroborates his statement. Ja'Cory, the next day, May 25th, said he didn't know anything about it. I'm sorry, there's the Mazda.
What did you all notice about the car?
Oh. Hold on. Why didn't you and Anwan just leave during the night?
So
Why didn't you? Well, he was gone.
I was too scared to be honest with you. I wasn't even in my right state of mind at that point. Me personally, I never seen, I never witnessed or seen it like that in my life. Hey, I don't know why we didn't leave, man. To be honest, I just was scared. We just did what he told us to do.
So 2 days after this whole situation, he's forced to participate in the murder, scared, not leaving. 2 days later, he's in an interview room, alone, no father, no mother, no one to talk to, knowing that the last people who told what had happened had ended up stabbed multiple times. So he told police he didn't know what happened. It was not until later, when he had been in custody, ironically safe from this whole situation, until he had an attorney, until he had time to think about this, that he came forward. I'm going to return to the slide that I had skipped. This is back to the back seat. I just wanted to play this for you in case you missed it. Oops.
What did you all notice about the car?
The backseat.
And so, how was that handled?
Cut the backseat out.
And who cut the back seat out? What did he do with the back seat after he cut it out?
We put it in the back of somebody's garage.
So that's why we don't have the back seat. Okay, hold on. I'll get to this in 1 second. But first I wanted to say, if you don't like the plea deals I did with these co-defendants, that's fine. I mean, that's my signature right there. You can write on the back of your jury forms, I think they got too much time. I don't think they got enough time. I don't think you should have amended down. Well, I don't know how you feel about this. So you can call me up later, look up my office's number, call my office. But if you believe what they told you, if you believe that he's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, then your feelings about this plea deal don't affect your verdict. I had to make a decision on what to do with Jacory Taylor and Anwan Carter. And one of the things that I knew was important was getting you all the evidence that you heard in this courtroom. And these are the sorts of things, sorts of decisions that we have to make in courtrooms all the time. Because the witnesses to crimes are often also the participants in crimes. So if you are mad at what I did, that is fine, let me know. But that doesn't mean that Brice Rhodes is not guilty of murder. And so let us talk about what you need to find under the instructions. So it's actually very logical. You go through page by page. You start with 1A, and then the language for murder and the language for manslaughter second is the same for each victim. I just picked Maurice here because he's the one in the middle. And what's in parentheses is the things that changed from instruction to instruction. So for Christopher Jones's murder, it says the 4th day of May, 2016, and shooting him with a gun. Obviously for Larry's, instead of Maurice, it says Larry, but the date and the manner are the same. But, so for each count of murder, your analysis is the same. You shall find the defendant guilty if you believe beyond a reasonable doubt that in Jefferson County, I think the instructions actually say in this county, but it's obviously Jefferson County, you saw the map, on or about the dates in question, that he killed each victim by himself or in complicity with others, and we've gone over all that, by shooting Christopher Jones, by stabbing Maurice and Larry, and that in so doing, he caused the death of each of them intentionally. And there's going to be an or that I'll flip to in just a second, or wantonly. You know it was intentional because he planned it, he premeditated it, he told the witnesses in advance that he was going to do it, and then he did it. But let's go to the or that in so doing he was wantonly engaging in conduct which created a grave risk of death to another and thereby caused the death under circumstances manifesting extreme indifference to human life. So I'm going to flip up to the definition of intentional and wanton. Intentional is what you think it is, when the objective is to cause that result, in this case being death. Wantonly is when someone is aware of and consciously disregards a risk, a substantial and unjustifiable risk, that the result will occur. And the risk must be of such nature and degree that disregarding it constitutes a gross deviation from the standard of conduct, standard of care that a reasonable person would observe. So what this means is, if you didn't think that he was shooting at Christopher Jones on purpose to kill him, if you thought he was just driving down the street, firing off a gun, not caring what happened, you would go to this second clause.
Judge, I object. Can we approach?
Sure. So if you believe that he's driving down the road, shooting his gun, not specifically intending to hit and kill Christopher
I'm
Jones.
sorry, can you all approach for just a moment?
Sorry, to make it clear, I'm giving you an example of how this could be a wanton murder. I'm not saying this is the only way it could be a wanton murder. So for an example, because wantonly means that somebody is aware of, okay, first of all, wantonly is not intentional. So that's what I'm saying. It's like we've moved past you. This is only in the circumstance where y'all think it's not intentional. So it would be wanton if you believe he's aware of and consciously disregards a risk. So he's aware that shooting somebody is dangerous. He consciously disregards the risk that shooting out the window he could hit a passerby. And that the risk of him hitting a passerby is of such nature and degree that disregard thereof constitutes a gross deviation from what a reasonable person would do. So if you think a reasonable person would know, I shouldn't shoot out the window because I might hit somebody, and that disregarding that is a gross deviation from reasonable care, and that he understood that risk was there and he consciously disregarded it, that would be an example of a wanton murder. So just to go back to this, if you believe that he intentionally murdered Christopher Jones and or Maurice Gordon and or Larry Ordway, or you believe that he wantonly murdered them, so the same with the stabbings, like that he was engaging in conduct that he didn't intend to cause murder, but it was such conduct that one would know could cause murder, that he knew it could cause murder, and that he did it anyway, and a reasonable person wouldn't continuing to stab somebody. That would be an example of a wanton murder with a knife in this circumstance. So if you believe that he intentionally murdered, let's just say Maurice, that he intentionally murdered Maurice, or some of you believe that he wantonly murdered Maurice, all you have, because you see that this is an or situation, as long as all of you believe.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as you all believe that it was intentional or wanton, then all of you believe it was murder, obviously beyond a reasonable doubt. So to start at the top, because I know this is really complicated, but I don't want to think that I could have explained it better and I just failed to. So in Jefferson County, on the date in question, by himself or in complicity with others, he killed Maurice Gordon by stabbing him with a knife. And we went over the complicity instruction earlier. that it was intentional or that it was wanton. So as long as you all agree that it was murder, then you can sign the verdict form for murder. Now, there is a sub part down here in your instruction for example on page 14. So the foreperson would sign either not guilty or guilty. So that part, you have to sign one of these, not guilty or guilty. Then, if you found him guilty of murder, you add in there if you agreed all 12 that it was intentional murder. So your choices on each of the murders is either not guilty, no more signatures, or guilty, and then maybe you all agree it's intentional and you sign there, or you don't all agree it's intentional and you don't sign there. So one of these top two has to have a signature, and then it's up to you as to the bottom whether it is in agreement that it's intentional. I apologize that our state gives, these are the instructions that we have. All right, so those are for each of the counts of murder. Now, if you don't find him guilty of murder, you go on to manslaughter in the second degree. If you do find him guilty of murder, you skip the manslaughter in the second degree. So it's murder, or it's manslaughter, or obviously not guilty, but you wouldn't find him guilty of murder and manslaughter for the same victim. It's one or the other. Now, you only go to manslaughter in the second degree if you have found him not guilty of murder. So if you do, you will see that the main difference is that there's no intentional on there. And that in the second clause, it just says that he was acting wantonly. So that A is he killed Maurice Gordon by himself or in complicity by stabbing him with a knife, and B, that in doing so he was acting wantonly. So it omits the intentional and it omits the grave risk of death to another, etc. But you don't get there unless you found him not guilty of murder. And I believe, obviously, that we have proven, for all the reasons I've stated, that this was an intentional murder. Now, there are 3 more charges. We have abuse of a corpse. And as you can see, that instruction defines each of the elements as on the 22nd day of May, 2016, he, alone or in complicity, placed the body of Maurice and the body of Larry in a yard off an alley and attempted to burn it, that he had no legal authority to do so, and that in so doing he treated each body in a way that would outrage normal family sensibilities. I think that's obvious. The other, here is Ja'Cory describing his knowledge of this.
And you just say dumped in the backyard.
And he told you the bodies were burned? Did he tell you where he dumped them? West End somewhere. Then the last one we haven't discussed is tampering with physical evidence. You have to find that on May 22nd, he, acting alone or in complicity, destroyed, mutilated, concealed, removed, or altered items from the North Height address, including a pink blanket or the knife or the back seat. If you believe that any of those items were tampered with, then this would come into play. That he did so because he believed that an official proceeding may be pending. That would be the investigation and prosecution. And that he did so with the intent to impair the availability, so that he burned the bloody clothing so that police couldn't find them and that we couldn't bring them into this courtroom. He ripped out the back seat so that police couldn't test it. We couldn't bring it into this courtroom.
Who's driving the car?
Brice driving the car.
Where do you go to?
We're going to like different dumpsters. Set dumpsters on fire.
Why different dumpsters?
Just to spread evidence.
You didn't take a bullet. When you got back, you was exposing the evidence.
What type of evidence?
It could have been clothes, it could have been, you said, receipts, I don't know what you call it, some of it was evidence.
And Was it stuff with blood on it?
Yes, ma'am.
What did you all do with that stuff?
It was took to a dumpster and they burnt the stuff up.
And that is how you know he is guilty of tampering with physical evidence. I have one last slide to show you.
Once presented, it involves pretty much murder. Just guilty of murder. I still can't say it.
Ja'Cory Taylor was 17 when this happened. He's 25 today. Anwan Carter was 15 when it happened. He's 22 today. They've both been to prison. They have both paid a heavy price for not having the courage, confidence to stand up to that man. Nothing compared to the price paid by the victims, obviously, but a price nonetheless. Brice Rhodes preyed on this group of children. He killed an innocent man for no reason. Then he killed 2 children for a horrible reason, because they confided in their mother. There is no other explanation, no other possible motive or defendant to explain why those children were murdered so horrifically. Please bring this 7-year nightmare to an end and find Brice Rhodes guilty of these murders. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we are going to draw who our random jurors will be. Counsel, would you all mind to come up?